The information that we're going to be talking about today is all going to be found in much better detail on Ian Carroll's video on his YouTube channel called Israel Unmasked. He does so much of a better description. This is just my summary for those who are close to me that want a summary of things that have been going on, what I have been learning. I am no expert. I am no guru. I am just hoping to give those close to me and those around me information for when disclosure finally does happen, they're feeling a little more anchored than what the collective will probably be feeling at the time. And as more truths are slowly being dug up, the closer and the closer I'm realizing we are to catastrophic disclosure. Welcome to episode 5. Today, we're going to be talking about propaganda, power, and plausible deniability. Now, I'm really excited to take you guys behind the curtain and beyond the veil today. Now, I do want to point out that there will be a disclaimer at the bottom of my screen today that I will be keeping up for the duration of the video to help avoid any possibility of this video being taken down because of the sensitive information that I will be talking about today. Before we get started, I want you to understand that propaganda is everywhere and it is coloring every perspective, and it's actually been indoctrinating us from a much younger age than a lot of us would really care to remember. And the only thing that got me to really wake up and realize was it really only takes one spark before you start to question everything else that you've been taught. I know it seems like there's a lot of chaos going on right now, but we're actually actively watching an empire crumble and decay from the inside. That's why things seem so chaotic, because the world is ending, but not for us, but for the people who actually control and run and manipulate the world. I'd like to first start today with beginning our episode of the 1920s. Now, in order to understand why we are where we are today, we need to go back relatively far into kind of the beginning of our relationship with Israel. Now, the 1920s is a very pivotal time, and that was, of course, it was during Prohibition. Now, basically what was happening was there were a lot of immigrants arriving to America, and they weren't really given the dream that they were promised. They ended up arriving to mega cities that were overrun. There was disease, there was crime, there was conflict, and because of that, natural segregation took place. And when I say natural segregation, I'm talking about basically where people stayed aligned within blood and family. Just because, imagine it like this: if someone were to get caught and be taken to the police, would you want it your family or a stranger who might turn you in? Now, some of the two most prominent gangs that were formed during this natural segregation was the Italian gang, or the Cosa Nostra. A lot of other people have called it the mafia as well as the Jewish mob. Now, these two became incredibly powerful during Prohibition. And they actually became so powerful that in ways some people would argue that they actually ran the entire country. Now, the issue was that they were fighting a lot. There's a lot of territory battles. There were a lot of people being murdered. And after a while, they started to realize, hey, if we work together, it actually might be in our benefit. And they were right. But some really important names that I want you to be aware of people that were at the meeting where the mob and the mafia decided to start working together was Myers Lansky and Lucky Luciano. Now, together, the mob and the mafia combined, created the National Crime Syndicate. And I'm not kidding you when I say they also called themselves Murder Inc. Now, one of the most notable side projects, you could say, for Murder Inc. was actually blackmailing the director of the FBI. Now, who am I talking about? Excuse me, my colleague wanted to make an appearance. But the person that they ended up blackmailing during this side project was J. Edgar Hoover. Now, he has quite a polarizing and controversial run during his time as director of the FBI from 1924 to 1972. That is a massively long run. Um, the basically how they were able to blackmail the director of the FBI is they got images and video, I believe, of him and his male aide. Now, if you look up J. Edgar Hoover, he was actually pretty prominent, being the one who was pushing a lot of the homosexual fear in the Lavender Scare during his time. Now, the issue is the blackmail actually kind of stopped in a way working on him, and he gave into the blackmail. Now, what do you mean he gave into the blackmail? Now, what had happened was J. Edgar Hoover started throwing parties at the Plaza Hotel. Now, not only did he throw parties there, but he actually had hidden cameras everywhere, littered throughout the entire Plaza Hotel. At these parties, there was a lot of homosexual intercourse, as well as cross-dressing, for lack of a better word, orgies. And it was with some of the most famous, prominent celebrities and politicians at the time. Now, this was actually the birth of modern day sexual blackmail. And actually, because of the Plaza Hotel and him giving into this, he actually created the world's most extensive library of blackmail up until Epstein. Now, not only did this help create leverage, this created an obscene amount of money. Now, when they started to create all this wealth, or this dirty liquor money, this blackmail money, you can call it, they actually founded Las Vegas. Now, in Las Vegas, they continued to launder money, to sell drugs, to sell prostitutes, as well as cheated gambling. From this, a whole industry sprung up. And now, what industry am I talking about? I'm talking about Las Vegas, the music industry, the movie industry, Hollywood. I don't know. Sound like someone familiar, possibly? Before we get into that, one thing I did want to point out is once prohibition ended, they didn't stop smuggling. They just stopped smuggling liquor, and they switched to selling different drugs, weapons, as well as children. The next time we're going to be jumping to is the mid-1930s during World War II. Now, during this time, the mob and the mafia were very powerful. And there was a relatively common conspiracy that a lot of people in the community were looking into when I was digging into this stuff. And I'm talking about the USS Lexington. Now, this was the Titanic times two. It was meant for troop transport. And what had happened was it actually had caught fire, capsized, and sunk in the harbor. We lost millions of dollars during this endeavor. There was a lot of fear when it initially happened that it was the Germans, And the government realized they had no control over their ports. Now, the popular conspiracy theory is that the mob and the mafia actually were the reason for the USS Lexington catching fire and capsizing. And you'll understand why with what I'm going to be bringing up next. Now, one thing I want you to understand is all of the dock workers were members of the mob or the mafia. Because it was the mob or the mafia that had created labor unions. Now, basically, what had happened at that point is because the US government realized they had no control of their ports, they had this brilliant idea to be like, you know what? Let's give total control of the eastern seaboard to the mob and the mafia. And they did. And not for a single second did the mob and mafia squander that possibility, and they started smuggling weapons out of the eastern seaboard. And what they were doing by smuggling weapons out of the ports was by helping a Rothschild's endeavor by founding Israel. The Rothschilds also realized that during World War II, a lot of Jewish people were being displaced, and they started thinking, wait a second, this could actually work out for us. And they started sending as many Jewish people as they could to Israel to create a British colony. Now, in order for them to finally found this land, a bunch of violence started and it escalated. And it started to escalate because of the weapons that were being smuggled out of the ports from the US, of the surplus weapons from us to Israel. We were giving them weapons the entire time. Now, along with this, basically the entire point of doing this is they were trying to make life as inhospitable as possible to get the Palestinians to up and leave. Now, a really popular conspiracy theory that I heard when I was looking into this is that when they finally did make life inhospitable and did ultimately end up taking over, that the Rothschilds actually received the rights to Palestine via mail. And if that doesn't tell you about the disgusting amount of wealth they'd have, I don't know what else will. During this time, there's 3 Zionist paramilitary groups I want you guys to be aware of. 3 of them. The first one is the Irgun. The second is the Lehi. And the third is the Haganah, although they did not receive the official title of terrorist group just because they weren't quite as brutal, I guess you could say, as the other 2 were. Now, what does it mean to be a terrorist? They were basically bombing and killing civilians. And what I want you to understand is there's actually a number of civilians that can be killed that is amount allowed acceptable before is considered a war crime. And obviously, 2 of those groups had reached those numbers and were doing disgusting things to make it their land, I guess you could say. Wildly enough, the Lehi group actually disagreed with Irgun when it came to the Nazis, and they actually were for Nazi fascism and control. And, it worked out for a while until it didn't serve the Lehi anymore. Now, there were 4 leaders from the Lehi group that went on and helped lead our current, what we call modern state of Israel. The first person is Mickey Cohen. He was a West Coast mobster. Cohen was active in raising funds for the Irgun. Benjamin Bugsby Siegel, a well-known mobster with ties to Lansky. Siegel was approached by Haganah emissaries for financial assistance and arms procurement. Meyer Lansky, a highly influential figure in the Jewish mob and the broader national crime syndicate. Lansky was instrumental in facilitating arms shipments. The next time that we're going to be jumping to is 1949. Now, this is when the fighting in Israel is completely done. Israel basically had the Lehi, the Haganah, and the Irgun disband due to widespread criticism. Now, these groups didn't just disappear and fall off the edge of the earth. They actually got absorbed into the IDF, and the IDF is today's Israel's Defense Force. Now, this isn't me being anti-Semitic. You can actually go onto IDF's official Wikipedia page, and it has this description there. Some notable names of people who came from this were David Ben Gurion, Ariel Sharon, Yitzhak Samir, Yitzhak Rabin, Shimon Peres, Moishi Dagan, as well as, one final one, Menachem Begin. These people actually went on to become presidents, prime ministers, and hold high seats in government, as well as becoming members of the Likud party. Now, I'm going to fast forward to the bombing in Hiroshima, and I want you to understand that this nuclear bomb was very much a triggering event for many countries when it came to intelligences. Now, we've come a long way from fighting war on the battlefield. Now, war is about the information field, financial markets, as well as held in the halls of policies, politics. It's not sword and who has the biggest army anymore. It's propaganda as well. The point that tends to keep intelligence agencies shielded from everything else is this very important term, and that is plausible deniability. Now, what is plausible deniability? Here's a hypothetical example. Don't like the Italian government? Well, you obviously can't send the US military in because that would be against the Constitution. So, how about we send in the mafia instead? They're the bad guys already, so if they get caught, it's just bad guys doing bad guy shit. Now, what I mean by that is if they get caught passing suitcases of money around multiple influential and multiple leaders to help sway an election in Italy, if the mafia gets caught, it's the mafia's fault. There is no tie to the government, there is no tie to other agency, thus giving them plausible deniability. It wasn't just the US. There were a lot of governments that realized how they would be able to use organized crime to their benefit, and this became a massive global issue and still is a global issue today. The ports went from smuggling weapons to smuggling nuclear weapons. Now, I'm going to be specifically talking about the nuclear weapons that were smuggled out of New Mexico. This is also referred to as the Apollo Affair. Now, this happened between the 1950s and the 1960s when there were Zionists that were secretly shipping out nuclear materials to Israel from the United States. Not only that, New Mexico was also founded by Jewish Zionists. and was funded by the Rothschilds. That is also a massive connection. Anytime there's a board member on the seat of a company or a megacorp, I'm always suspicious of their ties when there is a Rothschilds there. Now, before I get off on a rant about the Rothschilds, I want to bring up JFK, John F. Kennedy. Like I've said before, John F. Kennedy is a whole rabbit hole in and of his own. If you look into his assassination, I would definitely die on the hill of saying that the CIA was the one who killed it, along with having an Israeli influence. Anyways, let me go ahead and get back to the video. Now, JFK became increasingly more interested in the Israeli testing sites, and he was actually pushing for inspections. And not only that, after a while, he tried to push for the complete shutdown of these facilities. Wonder what happened to him next. One other important thing I want you to realize about Israel is they haven't signed the same treaties that all the other countries, have signed when it comes to nuclear weapons and nuclear warfare. Leading into that, I'd also heavily encourage you to look up the Samson option. Now, what is the Samson option? Basically, is if Israel were to ever get into a war and they start losing, they could throw a massive tantrum and just nuke everybody. What I'm saying is they could get mad at us being their greatest ally for not coming to their aid sooner and say, you didn't come help us soon enough. We're going to nuke you now. That is what the Samson option is. Let's go ahead and skip a little bit further into the future to 1982. This is when images and videos started circulating of civilians and refugees being killed by Israeli offensive forces. This was sent out by journalists who saw the destruction of what was happening in Palestine. This created a overall change in opinion for Israel. A really good example you could look up is the Sabra and Shatila massacre. It happened between September 16th to the 18th of 1982. It was the killing of 1,300 to 3,500 civilians, mostly Palestinian and Lebanese Shias. Shortly after the massacre, Israel founded Hasbara. What is Hasbara? Al Hasbara in Hebrew means is to explain. Now, I want you to understand that Hasbara changed it from the war on territory to the war on terror. Now, anyone who's from Generation 9/11 knows exactly why that sounds familiar. Because this basically went from Israel taking land to Israel saving us from terror. Now, during the Cold War, the military construct is basically what we are living in. And from that, we switched to an ideological construct. And Israel actually ended up hiring some of the best propaganda artists in the world at that time. Government officials, military, and civilians all were taught Hasbara. They have generations of people who were raised on Hasbara over the truth. And what's going to start happening is people are going to start believing Hasbara over the truth. That's why we have such a strong sense of national identity when it comes to the Israelis. Now, the other wild thing I wanted to bring up is remember the show The Apprentice that Trump used to be, the host of? Well, Israel had something very similar, and it was called The Ambassador. And it was very much like The Apprentice. It was basically where Israeli civilians came to compete for who could provide the best Hasbara. And they wouldn't win money, they would win a seat in Israeli government. So that way they could have a global position they could have a global seat for Israel and speak about how great they are and learn how to deflect off some of the most uncomfortable questions that Israel often get asked. Now, you could even look it up and go on Google. There are existing documents of Hasbara. I believe the one I'm thinking of exists in 2009, I believe. Yeah, the Hasbara manual published in 2009. Um, and honestly, in Hasbara, they actually talk about how to answer some of the hardest questions. A couple examples are, why did Israel use disproportional force in Gaza? As well as, will Israel bomb Iran? This was written in 2009 before what happened recently. Interesting. Um, Also, will Israel dismantle its settlements? I don't know. But they give you many examples on how to deflect and divert attention away from these examples so you don't actually have to answer the question. And if you watch many interviews or debates, that's what a lot of these Zionists do, is they don't actually give you answers. They dance around questions and deflect and try to get everyone's attention focused on something completely meaningless. Now, I also want you to understand that the news on Israel is very different here in the States than it is in the world. Israel may control the news here in the United States, but it doesn't control the news in the world. And that's why I definitely recommend disconnecting from legacy media, because they're going to give you propaganda. And we've been fed propaganda. We've been indoctrinated since a very young age. All I know is I'm starting to question a lot of the stuff I was taught in history, because remembering when Ian said that the truth only needs to be said once to be remembered, but a lie needs to be told multiple times in order to be believed, it's starting to feel a whole lot more prevalent in today's experiences. And also with the legacy media, if you've noticed, there is one topic they're being very careful about dancing around, and that's Jeffrey Epstein. And that's because there is substantial evidence of Jeffrey Epstein being a Mossad agent. Now, I want you to understand the difference between an agent and an officer, because I didn't really understand until after watching hours and hours of interviews and then finally realizing, oh, okay, that's what this means. So, the difference between an officer and an officer is somebody who actively goes in to the facility and is on the payroll, gets paid, works on the computers. An agent is someone who works out in the field and typically doesn't go into the office. They're the ones hired by the officer that are used for intel typically. Epstein was an agent, most likely an agent, less likely an officer. He was also most likely an agent for other countries as well. France is also super questionable if you've been watching Candace's streams as of recently. Same with other countries. I won't get into it anymore. But anyways, a big person too on Epstein's list was Ehud Barak, and he was Israel's prime minister at one point, and he was one of Epstein's most frequent flyers, along with Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was seen the most, as well as having Epstein seen coming to the White House during his administration. And I want to point out another interesting theory is that during the Oslo Accords, and I'll go ahead and post up some information here on the Oslo Accords first before moving forward. During this time is when the Monica Lewinsky scandal happened. Now, imagine if Israel also pushed, hey, thank goodness this was only about you and this young intern. There might be other videos we have, Bill, some darker series, but, thank goodness it was just this one that came out this time. Could have been worse. Kind of how blackmail works, I would say. The next conspiracy theory regarding this, also in timeline order as well, I'm going to be touching on 9/11. And I understand 9/11 is a very touchy subject for a lot of people, there were 3,000 Americans that were murdered in broad daylight, and we need to have the answers. But no one ultimately has actually been held responsible for the 9/11 terror attacks. And all I'm going to say is the government also has not disclosed all the information that the 9/11 Commission just brutally, completely just fumbled. And I would say fumbled on purpose. Now, one of the more prominent conspiracies on 9/11 is the dancing Israelis. Now, there was a group of Israelis who were caught cheering, super happy, taking photos, and overheard saying that they were happy that we were going to be joining the war effort. Now, I want you to think, who benefited from 9/11? Who benefited from us going to war with Iraq? It was no secret that Israel had conflict with Iraq, Iran, and Syria. They've had conflict with these countries for years, and they've been wanting to expand their borders for years. And they've wanted them all destabilized for many different reasons. And one of the biggest narratives, too, that I have been guilty of, that a lot of other people have been guilty of as well, is always assuming Muslims with terrorists. This is what Israel wanted to paint us with. So they wouldn't even be considered as a terrorist if they painted what an image of a terrorist actually is. And it's the people they've been fighting, the people of the land they've been trying to take over and completely ethnically cleanse. And they're not going to get away with it anymore. Generation 9/11 has woken up, and I guess I should say, for entertainment purposes only, we're not fucking done. I want you to understand that terrorism doesn't have a religion, it doesn't have a skin color, it doesn't discriminate. Terrorism is killing innocents and killing civilians. Now, I'm going to pose the same question that Ian poses. Does it feel like we live in a world where we're run by nice, benevolent beings? Or does it feel like we live in a world run by malevolent criminals? And if you feel like we're run by malevolent criminals, right, because we are. Now, what could support this theory of mine that we're being run by criminals? Got a few for you. They would need control over the banks and finances. They would need control over military power. They would also need control over media, music, and celebrity influence. Now, there's already a conspiracy that the Druze controlled all the banks. And sure, they don't necessarily control all the banks, but they control way more than the 2% that they suggest. And what about global military power? Doesn't America have global military power? Aren't we the ones that control global military power? Yeah, sure, but there's who controls America? There's 3 branches to our government: the judicial, the legislative, as well as the executive. Now, we're going to be zooming in specifically on the legislative today. And the reason I say that is because it's Congress who controls legislative, and we all know who controls Congress. If you don't know what AIPAC is, I highly recommend you take a moment and look into AIPAC. I'll post some information here on the screen now. Now, AIPAC controls Congress because they pay for Congress. And they honestly, I want to say they win, 98% of campaigns, as well as 93 out of 100 senators in 2024 were taking Israeli money. I don't know. Kind of sounds like they control Congress to me. Now, when it came to Epstein, I also want you to understand that there were certain people of power and influence that were pushed out of the light, or connections were cut very, very early on to try to stabilize their career. A really great example is Peggy Segal. She's known for bragging about her high profile list of friends. And I think it's like 30,000 some is what she was saying. It's really all a game of influence. And she has some of the best connections in Hollywood. And she also organized the get together for when Jeffrey Epstein got out of jail that very first time. Now, if this is starting to sound familiar, it should, because it sounds like Diddy. Now, I'm not saying Diddy was an Israeli. I will say his entire trial was a complete show trial. He wasn't going to be processed for anything. I realized that very early on. I was excited, but I was disappointed and led on at the beginning. But anyways, for Diddy, even though he's not directly connected to Israelis, here's just a couple important questions. Who wired his houses? Who gave him the record label? Who funded his parties? And who taught him how to do the blackmail? Not only along with that, with those questions you should be asking about Diddy, some other important questions just be asking in general to get your brain to start thinking about all this corruption that has been hidden in plain sight is who has this power? Who do these people, or why do these people make these decisions? Why is there not a single Epstein client that there has been prosecuted? And I hate to say it, but the Epstein networks are still very active, and his job position did not stay vacant. It was filled almost instantly, I would say. And when it comes to Epstein, a lot of people don't want to talk about it because it's a really touchy topic, but we need to start having uncomfortable conversations. We need to start talking about uncomfortable truths, because that's the only way this is going to be solved, is if we start talking about it. I want you all to understand that hating Jewish people is not the answer. That's going to continue a very, very vicious cycle that will never end, and we need to end this cycle. And there are many Jewish people who are in fear because of what these extremists are doing. Um, and it's not good. But we need to answer this with compassion and with truth. We need to call out mob like behavior, destruction, and manipulation when we see it. And our job's not done. It won't be done until people are held accountable and difficult conversations are had. Another difficult conversation that is being had is what is happening with the active silencing of free speech in this country. If anyone's been paying attention to the news lately, or not even news, the news isn't airing it because it's controlled. Um, but if you're not aware, Candace Owens' life has been threatened by the Macrons, and I am confident that the truth is going to be coming out, and I want to continue to spread this word, because if she's silenced, it's going to make this situation much worse. And the reason she's threatened to be silenced is because she is on the truth, and because she is exposing a lot of dark. And there's a lot of dark that goes back to France. And it's not about Brigitte being transgender. It's not about a gender issue. It's the fact that it was grooming. And not only that was it grooming, it's most likely incest. Incest to what level? I'm not sure, but it's absolutely sickening and disgusting. And I'm not going to live by in a world where my son's going to grow up in a world ruled by pedophiles. I'm going to be part of the cycle breakers that end this cycle. And I hope you will join me, because Candace is exposing the truth at a much bigger level than a lot of us are able to, with a massive platform of millions of people. And she is also hitting a truth on what is happening with Charlie Kirk, and the fact that the French may also be involved, as well as the Israeli government, with active cover up happening at Turning Point USA. I highly recommend looking into the Becoming Brigitte series. It makes it so you can't honestly go back. as well as watching Candace's coverage over the last few months of the assassination and public execution of her best friend. All seriousness aside, thank you guys so much for coming with me behind the curtain and beyond the veil. Remember, you're not crazy. You're just early. Next time on Tangled in Truth, I plan on covering all the mega corporations and the ties that the Rothschilds have to who controls our food and drug, our medications, cars, I mean, even down to funeral, feminine health, everything you could think of, the mega corporations have their tentacles in. And the light's going to expose the darkness. And I know it seems like a lot. This evil has always been here, but it's time to be exposed now.